Arcades are great, aren't they? But if you're under the age of 25, which the YouTube analytics tell me a substantial portion of my audience are, you might not fully appreciate just why old gits like me used to love these places so much back in the 1980s and 1990s, and just what was so special about them, and why a visit to a modern arcade just isn't quite the same experience. I've briefly touched on some of these aspects of arcades and retro gaming before in some of my other videos, but I really wanted to go into a bit more depth in this one and explore some of these factors that made a visit to an arcade back then such a unique and enjoyable experience, and so different to anything you'd experience today. So let's have a look at some of those reasons now, to help shed some light on the topic, preferably neon coloured light, with a slightly nicotine-tinged haze. As we discuss, what was so great about arcades in the 1980s and 1990s? Over the last couple of years, I've uploaded some videos featuring a couple of visits to some retro arcades and arcade bars, places that are full of iconic games from my childhood and teens. When you've got multiple old arcade titles in one space like this, they create this sort of collective audio-visual mishmash, which normally acts as a direct trigger to the nostalgia sensors in my brain. For reference, think of the starting up noise that happens in Flynn's arcade in the film Tron Legacy, when Sam Flynn powers on all the old arcade cabinets together near the start of the film. You immediately get one of the most iconically recognisable sounds in gaming, the noise of Mario jumping over a barrel in Donkey Kong. Then you combine this with something else, like the slow but steady advance of the Space Invaders coming down to get you. And then you add in another iconic sound like Pac-Man eating his dots. And the noises of Bub and Bob from Bobble Bobble jumping and blowing their bubbles. And then add in another mainstay of 1980s arcades back then, the familiar metallic ping of Arkanoid bashing its balls into the blocks. That sounds a bit dodgy. And then just to round off the experience, you of course can't have a retro arcade without hearing the familiar sound of Ryu and Ken Hadouking and dragon punching each other. Hadouken! And of course, let's not forget the obligatory call of Cowabunga from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cabinet. This combined sonic barrage was like a direct hit of sugar to my adolescent brain. Something that's got a particularly emotive effect on me now when I hear it again. Popular culture, specifically things like TV shows like Stranger Things, love to associate that time period with the 80s arcade. And it's no doubt because this collection of sights and sounds is like mainlining nostalgia and triggers a lot of very specific memories in the people like me that actually lived through this time period. It reminds me of the sense of wonder that visiting these places as a kid back then used to evoke. Because going to an arcade wasn't just about going to play some games. It was a full-on sensory experience. Arcades represent a bygone era of gaming that stretched from the 1970s through to the present day. But arcades today shouldn't be confused with the type of experience that going to an arcade in the 80s and 90s, back when I was a kid moving into my teens, represented. Because nowadays, there pretty much isn't anything an arcade game is capable of doing, from a purely audio-visual standpoint, that either your modern home console or PC wouldn't also be capable of replicating. In fact, this has pretty much been the case since about the early to mid 2000s onwards, as home systems finally caught up with their arcade contemporaries and have matched them ever since, with most modern arcade games running on regular PC hardware now. But back in the 1980s, when I very first became aware of arcade games as a young lad, there was a huge gulf between what home computers and consoles were capable of compared to what you'd experience in the arcade. My very first home computer was a ZX Spectrum 48K. I loved it at the time, but most of the early games were incredibly simplistic and had either blocky monochrome graphics or coloured graphics that clashed with the background. A lot of early Spectrum games were either single screen affairs or they trundled along at about 5 frames per second, with audio that more often than not was just a series of bleeps. You'd need to load the games from a cassette. These would normally take about 10 minutes to load up, presenting you with a full screen of strobing lines as the data tape screeched its info into the computer. Sometimes, inexplicably, the game would fail right at the end of the 10 minutes, meaning you'd have to load it up all over again from the start, with no guarantee it was going to work this time either. If you were playing a particularly big game, you'd need to load up new areas from the cassette as you progress through it. As I've mentioned in another video though, there were some absolute genius coders out there who managed to do wonders with some of their ZX Spectrum conversions of arcade classics like Chase HQ, Bubble Bobble, Rainbow Islands, and most notably the incredible specky port of R-Type, created by a gentleman named Bob Pape. But they still weren't a patch on the real deal arcade titles though. Arcade games back then looked unlike anything a home computer or console could do, with huge sprites that ran smoothly in full colour, with multiple layers of parallax scrolling and tons of enemies on screen at once. The music and sound effects were just on another level too. Games would often be full of digitised speech, with music that actually sounded like music, and sound effects like punches, kicks and gunshots that genuinely sounded like the real deal, rather than a load of bleeps and blops and other weird noises. Some of the games in the arcades back then had absolutely fantastic soundtracks. Afterburner by Sega was a game whose soundtrack 11-year-old me was particularly obsessed by. And remember, this was in the days before YouTube and Shazam. It wasn't like you could just easily listen to this music yourself at home. The only way you'd get to hear this music was by playing the game in the arcade. Let's just have a very quick listen to it now. It wasn't until about 10 years later, when I got the Sega Ages port of Afterburner for the Sega Saturn, that I was finally able to listen to this soundtrack at home, courtesy of the game's Red Book Audio. Another game with an absolutely incredible soundtrack that I also got a little bit obsessed by back then was the Ninja Warriors by Taito, a 2-player side-scrolling hack-em-up that came in an absolutely gigantic 3-screen behemoth of a cabinet. We're talking 3 full-size CRT screens here, laid out next to each other to create an extra long landscape for the characters to walk through. Let's have a quick listen to what is arguably probably its most famous tune, Daddy Milk, It's Stage 1 music. I mean, goddamn, that's pretty impressive for a 1987 arcade title. It still sounds just as good to me now as it did when I heard it for the very first time when I was a kid. And mentioning the Ninja Warrior's gigantic 3-screened cabinet there brings me on to another point from the old 1980s arcades as well, that really enhanced the experience compared to what you would have been playing at home. Bigger monitors. You see, this was back in the days before everyone owned a 50-inch 4K flat-screen LCD TV with a 5.1 stereo surround system. The majority of us would be playing our home console or computer on a 14-inch portable TV up in our bedrooms with a single speaker. In comparison, your average stand-up arcade cabinet had a 19-inch monitor, with some of the big deluxe sit-down cabinets you'd get, like arcade racers, sometimes having a cabinet as big as 25 inches. So it wasn't just that the arcade hardware was capable of playing games with better graphics and sound, the actual displays they were using were better as well. The difference between what you were seeing and hearing in an arcade title was light years away from what you could play at home. There was just literally no comparison. The sounds, the colours, the speed, the intense gameplay. These things all combined just created an experience you couldn't replicate at home. An experience that was further enhanced in the arcade by the fact that a lot of the cabinets had specialised control interfaces that went far beyond anything that you could use to play the game with at home. Like arcade racer cabinets with force feedback enhanced steering wheels. Steering wheels that actually let you control your on-screen vehicle with analog controls, giving you a far greater sense of control of your on-screen vehicle than you would have got at home using your digital joypad, joystick or keyboard. These analog controls weren't just restricted to things like racing games though. Afterburner, for example, had a flippin' great big aircraft yoke sticking out of it, which also had force feedback, so it would shake around as you were shooting down all the enemy aircraft. Or motorbike racing games like Super Hang-On had proper handlebar controllers. Or cabinets with things like machine guns mounted to them that would shake and recoil in your hands as you mowed down wave after wave of baddies. Even just your regular upright arcade cabinets offered a superior way to play the games than your average home computer, because the 8-bit home computer joysticks generally only had one fire button. Yeah, it looks like two buttons here, but they both only do the same thing, meaning if you were playing something like a platform game, you had to press up on the joystick to jump, which is a method of controlling your character that just absolutely sucks. It wasn't until the advent of the 8-bit home consoles that someone finally had the bright idea of adding an extra fire button onto your joypad. The 8-bit consoles did get some additional peripherals like light guns and steering wheels, but they weren't able to replicate that same experience you got in the arcade, like the tactile feel of the machine guns vibrating when you played something like Operation Wolf, and the Sega Master System's handle controller peripheral only having digital rather than analog controls. So arcade games didn't just look and sound better than their home contemporaries, they also offered a far more immersive way of playing them as well. Playing these arcade titles felt like a direct hit of dopamine to my 10-year-old brain. It made the arcade seem like this magical wonderland full of excitement and adventure. This feeling was only further compounded by the other big draw, the introduction of things like the Sega Tycoon body sensation cabinets, giant mechanically powered cabinets that you could sit in that would move and shake you around to the on-screen action, usually as a giant subwoofer behind you blasted you with the in-game sound effects and music. That, as I've already mentioned, sounded so far beyond anything your home computer could do. But the thing was though, despite the exciting neon-hued veneer these places had, sometimes they could also be a bit seedy. A lot of local arcades didn't just have games, they usually had fruit machines in there as well, what you'd call slot machines in the US, or pokies if you're from Australia. These areas of the arcade were often populated by older gentlemen with nicotine-yellowed fingers and beards, with a faint miasma of wee and white lightning cider around them, cursing and muttering away to themselves, pumping coin after coin into the fruity, trying to win back their losses. Smoking indoors hadn't been banned back then, so often when you first entered the arcade, there'd be this sort of foggy atmosphere of stale cigarette smoke just hanging around that you'd have to wade through. This was also normally at the point you began to wonder to yourself, just why is the carpet in this place so sticky? As well as all the old alkies on the fruities, there was sometimes a slight air of menace provided by the dodgy older kids you'd encounter down there sometimes. You know the ones I'm talking about. The ones with the dead-eyed stares and bum-fluff moustaches, who'd been huffing glue and nicking car radios since the age of 12, who suddenly sprouted up to 6'4" when they turned 14. The sort that, if they suggested you might want to offer them one of your credits, you did, for fear that you might suddenly find yourself looking down the blade of a flick knife if you didn't. I remember one scary kid like this suggesting I let him have 20p so he could play me in versus mode on Street Fighter 2. He then proceeded to spank me at the game, and I ended up getting booted off the cabinet because I lost. No wonder my mum always hated me going to these places. This was especially true if the arcade in question was the one that popped up as a part of the travelling fun fair that would annually visit my city. A place where the words health and safety were more of a vague notion than something that was ever put into practice on all the rides. In spite of this though, that feeling of some of these arcades being a bit seedy sort of combined with that feeling of wide-eyed wonder at playing all these incredible games in a really odd sort of way. Almost like that slight feeling of danger almost sort of enhanced the experience, like you were doing something a little bit edgy. It's a weird feeling to describe, but one I'm sure many other gamers my age have experienced. The other thing to bear in mind when you're visiting your local retro arcade back then was that your funds would be limited. A visit to the arcade would require tactically deploying your money to make it last for as long as humanly possible. I'd normally only have a couple of quid to spend, and your average standard upright cabinet back then was usually about 10 to 20p a go. Did you want to try and extend your cash by sticking to the uprights you knew you could last on for a while, like Shinobi, R-Type or Bubble Bobble? Or did you want to risk it on that game you really liked but you knew you'd be dead at within minutes, like Gunsmoke? Or did you want to spunk the whole lot on the new deluxe Afterburner or Outrun cabinet, which could vary from as much as 50p to £1 a go? Choices. Knowing your precious time with these games was limited only made the desire to play them greater. It's not like playing something in MAME, where you can just insert as many virtual credits in as you like to keep playing. Moving on from the era of the early 8-bit microcomputers, such as the Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC and the Commodore 64, into the era of the 8-bit consoles like the Sega Master System and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the 16-bit home computers like the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST, things improved considerably, but the gulf was still there as arcade hardware itself continued to evolve and improve. It wasn't really until the 16-bit home consoles hit the scene that some games started to feel almost on a par with the arcade, with Mega Drive games like Golden Axe, Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Hang-On, Afterburner, Strider and Street Fighter 2 Special Championship Edition proving to be incredibly close approximations of their arcade big brothers, and original titles like Revenge of Shinobi and the Streets of Rage series being on a par with the sort of quality you'd expect in an arcade title. Arcade perfect was a term that was bandied about frequently by a lot of the games mags back then, but this was rarely ever completely true though. The Mega Drive port of Golden Axe, for example, was often cited as being arcade perfect, but this just wasn't the case, with the home port lacking a lot of the arcade sampled speech and looking slightly less colourful and detailed, and also little details like the defeated enemies not turning to stone and staying on the floor after you'd killed them. Despite these little differences though, it really did feel to me like you were playing the proper arcade version at home, And let's just say, this was a massive step up from my old days of gaming on the Spectrum. As we moved across into the 32-bit era though, this was where the arcades once again took a quantum leap forward, with early 3D polygon titles on consoles not looking a patch on their arcade contemporaries, which often ran on bleeding edge bespoke hardware like the Sega Model 2 and Model 3 boards, which cost thousands of pounds. These cabinets also tended to offer a further advantage over their home contemporaries, with the ability to be linked up and played in multiplayer, with games like Virtua Racing and Daytona USA offering an absolutely whopping total of 8 cabinets that you could link up. Normally, the best you'd be able to experience at home would be a single TV 2-player split screen, with only a few home consoles and PC games starting to offer the option of system link and LANs. So again, moving forward from the 80s into the 90s, the arcades were still able to offer an experience that you couldn't experience at home in the same way. And to an extent, this is still the case now, with dedicated arcade racing cabinets offering a multiplayer experience unlike the sort of feeling you'd get from playing a racing game online. Being able to glance over at the screen on the cabinet that your friend's playing on, and then laughing in their face and calling them a knobend after they crash into the Sonic wall on 3.7 Speedway. It wasn't really until we got into the 6th generation of consoles, and I'm thinking specifically of the Sega Dreamcast as the forerunner of this, that we got to a point that home systems have finally completely caught up with the arcades. With games like Hydro Thunder, Daytona USA 2001, Ferrari F355 Challenge, and Soul Calibur looking equally on a par with their arcade counterparts. In some cases they even look better. Soul Calibur was actually more impressive looking than the arcade original it was based on. I mean, seeing graphics like this just running on a home console back then was pretty mind-blowing. The last thing just to mention about the appeal of the retro arcades back then was the sheer wealth of games a decent arcade would present you with, particularly if it was something like a large arcade on a pier in a seaside town like Portsmouth or Weston-super-Mare, which quite often would tend to have a larger quantity of things like the big sit-down arcade races and the big 2-player light gun cabinets. Console games were expensive back in the 80s and 90s. Your average Sega Master System or Mega Drive game could cost anything from £25 to £60, and most of the other kids I knew didn't tend to have an absolute ton of games, well, apart from a couple of spoilt little bastards. I think the maximum amount of Mega Drive games I ever owned at any one time as a kid, built up over several years, was about 8 or 10. And this was a continual cycle of trading certain old games in and picking up new ones second hand so they weren't quite so pricey. So getting to a huge arcade and being spoilt for choice with so many varied games, often brand new state-of-the-art titles, was always a treat. It's not like today, where people are just inundated with games, with so many ROMs and emulators being freely, if not always legally, available online that you can play on a plethora of different devices. For example, I bought a Nintendo 3DS a while back and then jailbroke it and then stuck a 64GB micro SD card in it, which I've subsequently loaded up with emulators and old games. I've got Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, PC Engine and Sega Master System emulators on there, which each have a folder with about 100 games in. I've even got some MAME arcade titles on there too. I've got several different emulators on my mobile phone, a lot of them actually more advanced than the sort of ones that I can use on the 3DS. When I think back to how few games I ever owned in a single sitting as a kid, how I'd always need to trade in an old console to get a new one, it just feels like absolute insanity to think I've now got all those consoles with hundreds of games on each on a device that I can just carry around with me in my pocket. I mean, as someone that didn't even own a Game Boy until I was well into my 20s, That would have just absolutely fried 10-year-old me's brain. To have so many games available, just at the tip of my fingers, that I can take with me anywhere I go. I mean, even today, stuff like MAME, Model 2 emulator and Supermodel still absolutely blow my mind a bit. The thought that pretty much every single arcade game I've ever drooled over and desperately wanted to play as a kid is now sat on my hard drive, and that many of them contain less megabytes of information than your standard JPEG file. So I hope that helps to provide a bit more insight into why exactly arcades were such magical, if sometimes slightly iffy, places back in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. It was a truly fantastic time to be a gamer. Seeing these games evolve and improve over time, as the home market likewise slowly caught up. Arcade games weren't just constrained to places like the local arcades, piers and fun fairs. What was so great is you could encounter them in all sorts of different locations, like in your local chippy or swimming pool, or the bar in the hotel your parents had dragged you off to on holiday, or the ferry you took to get over there, or the airport. I have very vivid memories of playing Chase HQ on a cross-channel ferry to France, and encountering a bubble cabinet on an overnight ferry to Ireland, and just being utterly entranced by it. Motorway service stations usually used to have an arcade with a couple of games in them, but the only thing you'll find in them now is fruit machines. Modern arcades are still able to provide an experience you aren't going to get at home, with things like Star Wars Battle Pod's huge dome-screened cabinet, and light gun games like Dark Escape 4D, with its 3D goggles and interactive features. But the feeling of going to a modern arcade just isn't the same. The year before last, I stayed in a holiday park for a weekend with a few mates, and the on-site arcade had literally 3 games: 2 link-up Mario Karts, 2 link-up Cruise and Blasts, and a Jurassic Park. Everything else in there was some sort of redemption machine type thing. We're talking like 80% of the floor space taken up with them. Also, the more family-friendly feel of these sorts of places feels at odds with the arcades of my youth, with no chance of bumping into Mr. Bum Fluffy Stabby McStabface. But, maybe that's actually not such a bad thing. It's great to see though that the retro arcade scene appears to be flourishing and providing people with a taste of what these places were like back in the day. And hey, wouldn't you rather be somewhere where you can play stuff like Sega Rally, Time Crisis, Outrun 2, Street Fighter 2 and Afterburner than somewhere filled with shitty claw games and other crap like that? So, I have been Mr. Thunderwing. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip down memory lane with me. I'd love to hear about some of your memories and experiences of old school arcades, and if you're someone who wasn't old enough to experience them firsthand, what your experiences have been like at any retro arcades that you've been to. Let me know in the comments. Right, take care gang, I will catch you again soon. Cheerio, bye.